Imagine calling emergency services from a freezing mountain, telling them you're exhausted, disoriented, and suffering from hypothermia. Now imagine that rescuers know roughly where you are. They come looking, but instead of finding you, they find your backpack, your sleeping bag, your tent, your food, and then nothing. This is the disturbing mystery surrounding 18-year-old British student George Smyth, who disappeared alone in Romania's Bucegi Mountains in November 2025. His last known communication was a desperate call for help. His belongings were eventually discovered, but George was nowhere to be found. And now, months later, after repeated searches and newly accessible terrain, one terrifying question remains. How does someone disappear from a mountain after telling rescuers exactly where he is? On November 23, 2025, George Smyth, an 18-year-old British student at the University of Bristol, was in Romania. What happened next would turn an ordinary trip into one of the country's most haunting missing person cases. George had traveled into the Bucegi Mountains, a dramatic region of peaks, valleys, snow, and unpredictable winter conditions. The area is also located near Bran Castle, the famous tourist destination often associated with the legend of Dracula. That detail would later make headlines around the world. But behind the sensational nickname was a very real and dangerous environment. George was hiking alone. At some point during his journey, something went wrong. According to reports, he became disoriented and began experiencing extreme exhaustion and symptoms of hypothermia. Eventually, he made the decision that could have saved his life. He called emergency services. This should have been the moment when the mystery ended. A young man was lost. He was in trouble, but he had managed to communicate with rescuers. They knew he needed help, and they knew the general area where he was located. Yet this is where the story takes a disturbing turn. Because after that call, George didn't simply disappear into the mountains. He seemed to vanish almost completely. And the question that would haunt investigators was already beginning to form. What happened between the moment George called for help and the moment rescuers arrived? George's emergency call is one of the most important pieces of this entire mystery. He reportedly told Romanian emergency services that he was suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. He was also disoriented. That information immediately changed the situation. This was no longer a routine hike. George was vulnerable. The cold was becoming a serious threat, and in the mountains, every minute mattered. Rescuers reportedly advised him to retrace his route and keep moving, warning him not to fall asleep because of the danger posed by the cold. At this point, there was still hope. George had contacted the outside world. His location was being investigated, and rescuers began moving toward the area. But then came the most puzzling discovery. Search teams found George's backpack. Inside were important pieces of equipment, including camping supplies and provisions. But George himself was gone. Think about that for a moment. If George was cold, exhausted, and lost, why would he leave behind equipment that could help him survive? Was he trying to reach safety? Did he become confused because of hypothermia? Did he suddenly decide to abandon his route? Or did something happen that forced him to leave the backpack behind? The answers remain unknown. And what makes the case even more unsettling is what rescuers did not find. There was no clear explanation for where George had gone. No confirmed sighting. No definitive trail leading to safety. Just a backpack sitting in the mountains. And an empty space where an 18-year-old should have been. Once George was reported missing, the search became a race against nature. Romanian mountain rescue teams began searching the Bucegi Mountains under extremely difficult conditions. The terrain was rugged. Snow made movement dangerous. Weather conditions changed rapidly, and avalanche risks created another threat for the people trying to find him. Rescuers used multiple methods to search the area: helicopters, search dogs, thermal imaging technology, and teams of mountain rescuers moving through difficult terrain. But the mountain seemed to be hiding its secrets. George's backpack was found, yet there was still no sign of George himself. The longer the search continued, the more complicated the mystery became. Because if he had simply become lost, why wasn't he found? If he had continued walking, where did he go? And if he had suffered a fatal accident, why had rescuers been unable to locate him? The weather offered one possible explanation. Snow and extreme conditions can erase tracks. A mountain can change dramatically in a matter of hours. A person can disappear beneath snow or become trapped in terrain that is almost impossible to reach. But there was another problem. George had already made contact with emergency services. He had told them he was in trouble. That means there was a narrow window of time when rescuers knew he was alive. And somewhere between that phone call and the arrival of the search teams, George disappeared. Perhaps the most haunting object in this entire case is not a photograph. It is not a phone. It is not even the mountain itself. It is George's backpack. Because a backpack tells a story. It tells us what someone thought they would need to survive. George had equipment. He had supplies. He had camping gear. And yet, according to reports, rescuers eventually found the backpack without him. That raises one of the biggest questions in the case. Why would George leave it behind? There are several possible explanations. The simplest is that hypothermia and exhaustion affected his judgment. As the body becomes dangerously cold, confusion can develop. A person may make decisions that would seem completely irrational under normal circumstances. George could have believed he was heading towards safety. He may have thought help was closer than it actually was. Or perhaps he became disoriented and wandered away from the area. But there is another possibility. What if George didn't leave the backpack voluntarily? What if an accident happened nearby? What if he fell into an area that was difficult to see from above? Or what if the mountain conditions simply concealed him? These are possibilities, not established facts. And that's exactly what makes this case so frustrating. The evidence doesn't provide a clear answer. There is no confirmed final destination, no verified explanation, only a phone call, a backpack, and an enormous mountain range. In 2026, the search for George Smyth continued. As weather conditions changed and snow melted, rescuers were able to access areas that had previously been extremely difficult or impossible to reach. Hope remained that the changing conditions might finally reveal something, a clue, a piece of equipment, a trail, anything. But a renewed search in July 2026 ended without finding new evidence. George remained missing, and that leaves his story suspended between possibility and tragedy. Perhaps the mountain claimed him. Perhaps hypothermia caused him to become disoriented and move far beyond the area where rescuers expected him to be. Perhaps there is still a location in the Bucegi Mountains that search teams have not been able to reach. Or perhaps the answer is hidden in something investigators have yet to understand about those final moments. We may never know. But one thing is certain. George Smyth entered those mountains as a young man on a journey. He made a call for help. Someone knew he was in danger. And then, somehow, he vanished. Today, the mountains remain. The backpack was found. The search has continued. But George himself is still missing. And until the mountains finally give up their secret, one question will continue to haunt this case. What really happened to George Smyth after that final call for help? Maybe someday someone will find the answer. Until then, the mystery remains.